Hey, what's up, family? We are here. It's actually, is this day 4?
It's a lot.
We're going to recap day 3. We're in the morning on day 4, and it is super early, but we were knocked out after day 3, and you'll kind of hear why. It's something like
14.
14 hours on the trail, which was awesome. Like almost, I think, 9 miles of walking, which was did not seem like that much. So don't let that scare you in the future. Enjoyed every minute of it. But we hit 3 different places today, which is why it was such a long day. But yeah, all 3 of them were just incredible. We started at what was it?
Aeropolis?
Aeropolis, yes, Aeropolis, yes, sorry. Well, we started there. We started our morning there. We actually started with a hot air balloon ride that actually took you up. We'll post some of the pictures. I think maybe already have all the days running together. We started with a hot air balloon ride at like early morning. Like we got up at 4 here, and got up and took the hot air balloon up with a bunch of our group, and you could see almost all 7 of the areas where the churches of Revelation are going to be. And so just a really cool, and just to be able to see the, like, I think the terrain from the air, like that really put it in perspective, like how Paul and the disciples are traveling, like to see what they're going over and around and through. And so it was just a really cool experience just to see the terrain, and just obviously just really beautiful. But yeah, that's how we started our morning. And then we moved over to Hierapolis. And what do we do in Hierapolis? Where did we start at?
The City of the Dead.
Yeah, that we started in the necropolis.
So he told us that the majority of the people are going to start at the central location. Is that what
Yeah, they're
told
gonna
us?
see all the kind of like the touristy parts, and we started in the necropolis, which means like the city of the dead, or the under city. And like essentially it's just like the graveyard. And so we walked through like there's something like 25,000 sarcophaguses and graves and stuff like that. So we started there, and he started out. How did he start us out? I thought it was really cool.
He made us walk backwards.
Yes.
Actually, the whole trip has been really cool. We'll probably reflect on it much better later. But like he started off and he said, "Just hear me out." He's like, "Just start walking backwards." And we all did it. Like we didn't hesitate at all. We just turned around and we walked backwards like 10 steps. And then later he told us why, because he said we're starting in the City of the Dead, because he said one of the quotes he said is that everyone wants to rule the world, but they all end in the City of Dead. And so we started in the City of Dead, whereas everyone else, once we figured out at the end, we're at like the central like city, where it's awesome. I mean, it is really cool. But we started at the back.
Yeah, we started at the back, and and one of the things I wrote down is he said, "What if we just lived our lives with the end in mind? If we start with the end in mind?" And he said, like, everyone ends up here. And so we just talked about that. Like we walked backwards into the necropolis, which I thought was a little weird at first, and then made sense when we sat down and talked about it. But we started there in the City of the Dead, and then kind of moved on. What do we hit after? We took a long hike up to the highest point in Hierapolis, and ended at a place where like he kind of just let us kind of look around and see, and then we kind of took guesses on what this place was. You walked into it, and it was kind of a circle, almost like looks like an arena. Like there's big columns all the way around, and we kind of took guesses on like, hey, what was here? What is this place? And what did it end up being?
It was where Philip was killed.
Yeah, it was where the place that they. So we started at the necropolis, and then we walked through the city gates, and then we walked up this trail really high up into the mountain, and we stopped at this place where the disciple Philip was murdered.
It was kind of one of the, when you think about it now, like, because he told us it was a place where like nobody goes. So it was kind of one of those.
It was a hard trek to get up there. Yeah, I mean, well, for me, not for Jen.
It was really cool. It was awesome. It was straight up, but like. Once we got up there, it was something I like to notice the things, I guess, but there was like weeds and like more weeds, more of the little prickly things that keep getting in our shoes. But like it was like more just overgrown stuff. So like when he talked about it was the place that like nobody went, it kind of put it into more.
It wasn't. It's not on the
perspective.
normal tour.
No, because we went and all of these things. We kept cracking. I was trying to tell Matthew there were snakes everywhere, but like it was like it was definitely not a place that really hardly anyone looked like they visited.
Yeah.
Kind of close, you know what I mean, compared to all the other places that we've been.
We have seen several snakes, and I'm not a fan of Turkey for that reason. But snake,
metal,
huge, things that look like snakes. Who knows? They're all scary. It doesn't matter when you're in a different country.
Yeah,
but so we walked up to this place, and Tommy kind of sat us down, and we had a moment there where we're all kind of guessing what this place is, and then he tells us it's the place that Philip was murdered. And like we kind of walk through, the text was in. Do you remember where the text was? I wrote it down, but now I'm losing my mind.
Everywhere. John.
Yes, in John. Yeah, that's what he's talking
12?
about. Yeah, John 12, I think. But he was talking about we walked through the story of Philip, and so he walked us through where what church history says about Philip. Like Philip, because Philip came and prayed with the governor's wife because she was really, really sick, and she had come to Hierapolis, and she had tried everything basically, and Philip comes and meets her, prays with her, and God heals her, and then she becomes a follower of Christ, and the governor is furious about this. And essentially he has Philip flogged in the city gates where we stood in front of and walked through. And then he has him drugged by horse up these roads that were just they're hard to walk now, and they're just awful. Just think about his body being ripped up to those things. Then he's pulled up the hill to this place that we're sitting at. And then he's crucified right there in that space. Yeah. And we kind of just walked through, and Tommy just kind of talked about how Philip got that call from Jesus to follow me. And he said the call of a rabbi was to follow me as I follow Jesus. Follow me and look like me. And so he said the rabbi would choose guys or choose men based on who he thought could look like him and replicate the life that he had done. And then we kind of just ended with hey, at the end of Philip's life, Philip looked an awful lot like Jesus because he was crucified like him, he was whipped like him, he was tortured like him, and ultimately he died for Jesus on that hill, which I was like, holy cow. And we kind of just left that place with the question, at the end of your life, will you look much like Jesus? And man, I thought that was so powerful for us. So anything else from Hierapolis that stood out to you?
No, I really like that story about Philip because that was the last thing he said was Philip's whole life is the answer to that question, can we see Jesus?
Yeah.
Which was just, that was super, there was just a lot of connection there because that was the question he asked us. Will our life show?
Will your life look like Jesus?
Can they see Jesus?
Yeah. Can they see Jesus through you? Will you? I was blown away. When you think about what Philip went through, and he just said at the end of Philip's life, Philip looked a heck of a lot like Jesus.
Yeah,
which was pretty amazing. So, all right, and then we went from Hierapolis, and then we went over to Colossae and spent some time there. Colossae is actually a really neat site because it's mostly unexcavated. So I think starting in July of this year, they have a person and a team that's coming to start major excavations on Colossae. But we went to the top of the mountain. It's called the Tell of Colossae, and it's unexcavated, and so it's city on top of city on top of city on top of city. So they call it a tell. And so we were up there. It's kind of the highest point in the city, obviously, because it's been built on top of each other. And so we just talked about we talked a lot about Philemon and Onesimus and Paul's letter back to Philemon, and we talked about how Paul probably sent the letter to Philemon and Colossians at the same time, because they would have been on the same mail route and all those kinds of things. So it was a really, really cool story. What stood out to you about Colossae?
They talk a lot about his runaway slave.
Yep.
We talked about him a lot, and how we can relate to him being the runaway slave.
Yeah. We talked about the first day. We talked about kind of Paul's background and his upbringing, and church history tells us that Paul probably became Roman because he was there's this term called manumission, which is a thing where a slave's master purchases their freedom, right? And so that's probably how Paul became Roman. Like his family was probably, and not just the master doesn't just purchase his slaves' freedom, but it's his whole family becomes essentially part of his family. So that's probably how we think Paul probably became Roman. Like at one point, like his grandparents or great grandparents were probably manumitted into a Roman family, and so he talked about that as Onesimus comes to Paul, and he shares kind of what Jesus is doing, what the gospel has done in his life, and Paul writes this letter back to Philemon. He probably has that in mind. That's probably why it's important for him to say, like, hey, make sure I'm going to send Philemon back to you, or I'm going to send Onesimus back to you, and make sure you treat him not like a slave, but like a brother in Christ, which was so important and so powerful when you're standing there in that space in Colossae and you're thinking about like, oh, Paul would have done this, Paul would have wrote this. And this is why Paul thought it was important, because this was an important factor in Paul's life as well. So we kind of kept that idea in mind, and we talked about how Philemon is a perfect picture of the gospel. Mm-hmm. Like Jesus has removed us from slavery and he's paid the price. One of the other things, what's interesting about Philemon that Paul says, like that he wrote it like himself, right? Mm-hmm. It was an important piece that like Paul wrote it by his own, and like normally Paul would have just dictated like one of his letters, but in this case he wrote it himself. And I thought that was really, really powerful to think about that in terms of sending Onesimus back to Philemon, who essentially would have been his master, right, at that point, and so I thought that was really, really cool, and I loved. Tommy talked about how Paul kind of approaches Philemon as a brother in Christ, and he says, "Hey, if Onesimus, if he owes anything, just put it on my tab, and I'll take care of it." And that was a perfect picture of the gospel, right? Which I thought was so cool. We just spent just a little bit of time in Colossae. And then we moved to the first church of the 7 churches that we're going to study while we're here. It's called Laodicea, and you may have heard it pronounced as Laodicea, but here they pronounce it Laodicea or Laodicea. And so we spent time there, and it was actually probably the most impressive city that we've been in as far as like what they had built and all of those kind of things. Yeah, it was gorgeous. There was marble everywhere. Like still as they're excavating it now, like you could there's just marble on the ground. Like you walk over like marble streets and marble columns and walk by the columns and the statues, and it's just really, really beautiful. It was huge. Yeah, and it was massive. Yes. Yeah. What stood out to you about Laodicea?
I think it's a lot of that was probably your favorite part, because one of the unique things that I think of, like the way that you present things and the way that you go and you learn, because I think the easiest way for me to learn is like in context. And so one of the things they did at each site that we did is we talked about water. So when we started the day, Tommy kept telling us to just think of like the water. And what was our key takeaway thing from today? So restoring the gospel was yesterday.
Yeah, in the water piece, he said, I wanted you to keep that in mind, because when we were at Hierapolis had hot springs.
We did visit a place that he made us.
Yes, they had hot springs where people would come, and it was it was really cool. I'll show you some pictures of it. But they had hot springs where people would come and they thought they had healing powers. And then when we got to Colossae had really, really cold water from like a spring that was naturally fed.
But it was pretty unique because he took us to a place where there was this little waterfall, and he said, "Hey, just go through this and just go put your hands in it." Yeah. And every time we did something, like we just did it, and then he would tell us later like why we did it. And context. So then at the very end of the day, when we ended up here,
when we went to Laodicea, like they had no natural water source, so they had built an aqueduct that was like 20 miles away, and when it got all the way to to the city, what was
it was lukewarm.
Yeah, it was lukewarm.
So we went from the hot springs, and then we went to the cold, and then we went to the lukewarm.
Which gives you so much context to Revelations 3 when he talks about I'd rather be hot or cold, but if you're lukewarm, I spew you out of my mouth, right? Or I vomit you out, right? So it gives so much context to that. Like Jesus knows his church. He knows the church at Laodicea, and he knows exactly what their heart is, which I thought was so powerful. And so I told Jen on the way back, I was like, I'm gonna preach this. I gotta preach this at some point. And so
That's why you can't go over too much.
yeah, so I don't want to give you too much. I don't want you to hear all of it on here, but yeah, it was really, really like we looked at like the first church there at Laodicea was probably a house church, and so we started there, and then we went to the church that they actually build, and man, it was really, really interesting. One of the things that we noticed about the letter, and it's in Revelations 3 to the church at Laodicea, is it's the only church that gets criticism and no encouragement, if that makes sense. Like they don't get a, hey, you're doing this really good, but you need to work on that. Every other church gets some version of that. Laodicea only gets criticism. And one of the things that we pointed out was Tommy talked about how Laodicea is the only church that didn't face any kind of resistance in building the church either. Like they were in a place where everything was good. People were excited for them to have the church and all those kinds of things. There was no resistance against them. And then uniquely, like they're the only church that they only get criticism in the book of Revelation. So it was interesting. I just thought that was interesting. I thought, does that mirror kind of the American church where we don't have much resistance? And so anyway, it was just a thought for me when we were thinking about that. And so anyway, I thought that was awesome. Anything else you thought on day 3?
It was a really good day.
Yeah, it was a good day.
They're all good days. They're all
yeah.
unique, and they're all better and everything.
Today we're headed to Ephesus, so I'm excited about that. I think we're going to spend the whole day there, and so exciting. All right, that's the end of day 3. We'll see you back. Gosh, tonight we're going to do one tonight again for day 4. All right, see you guys soon.